Not all funerals end with eternal rest. Some, like my grandfather's, seem to be the beginning of something much darker. My name is Ethan, and I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, where traditions and supernatural stories intertwine with everyday life. Since I was a child, I always knew that death was not just the end. It was a transition, a step into something unknown. But what I experienced when my grandfather died in 1992 completely changed my perspective on what that meant. The day he passed, the whole town came to the funeral. My grandfather, Mr. Robert, was known for his ability to solve problems, although not always in the most honest way. My mother used to say that in his youth he had made deals he never wanted to talk about. Despite that, everyone loved him. He had that rare talent of convincing people he was always right, even when he wasn't. But there was something strange about him, something I couldn't understand as a child. Sometimes, when he talked to me, his eyes seemed darker, as if he carried an invisible weight. His death was sudden. He was at home, sitting in his favorite armchair when he simply stopped moving. It was as if something had switched him off instantly. There were no signs of illness, no warnings. My mother said it was God's will, but I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way they found him, his head tilted to one side, lips slightly parted, as if he had tried to say something before dying. The funeral took place at the town's main church, an old stone building with a heavy atmosphere. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt something was off. There was a strange smell, like damp earth mixed with something metallic I couldn't identify. The candles flickered more than usual, even though there was no wind, but no one else seemed to notice. Neighbors whispered prayers, and my family sat at the front, near the open casket. Everything was going as planned until the priest began to speak. His voice filled the space, and at that moment something happened that no one could explain. The crucifix above the altar, a wooden figure that had hung there for decades, suddenly fell to the floor. The crash echoed through the entire church, and everyone fell silent. The priest tried to continue as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere grew unbearably tense. Some crossed themselves, others whispered that it was a bad omen. I could only stare at my grandfather's casket, waiting for something else to happen. That night after the burial, I dreamed of him. He was sitting in his armchair as always, but he wasn't alone. Around him were bones, not animal or human bones, but something twisted and alien, like they didn't belong to this world. He was crying, something I had never seen him do in life, and he whispered words I could barely understand. But there was one phrase that stuck with me. It wasn't my time. I woke up drenched in sweat, with the feeling that something terrible had just begun. The following days were no better. My mother said it was grief, that I was seeing things because I missed my grandfather. But what happened in our house defied logic. At night, the sounds began. First, slow, heavy footsteps echoed through the halls, like someone wandering aimlessly. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but soon everyone in the house started to hear them. My younger sister, Emily, cried every night, saying she saw a shadow in the hallway. My mother tried to calm her, but she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. One night I decided to stay up to see what was happening. I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring down the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Everything was silent until it started. The footsteps coming from the far end of the hall, moving closer, step by step. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them clearly. When they reached the end of the hall, right in front of me, the sound stopped. For a few seconds nothing happened, and then the armchair my grandfather used to sit in creaked, as if someone invisible had just sunk into it. Fear froze me in place, but I couldn't look away from that chair. Something was there, even if I couldn't see it. I felt a presence so intense it made it hard to breathe. When I finally gathered enough courage to turn on the light, the chair was empty, but there was something on the floor I hadn't noticed. Before, a mark right in front of the chair. It was a footprint, but not like any normal shoe print. It was larger with a strange shape, like something inhuman had stood there. My mother began calling priests and spiritual healers, desperately searching for a solution. They all said the same thing. My grandfather's soul wasn't at peace. One of them, an old man who seemed to know more than he was willing to say, asked if my grandfather had ever made a pact during his life. My mother denied it immediately, but I remembered his words from the dream. It wasn't my time. There was something he hadn't told us, something he had done that was now keeping him bound to this world. We decided to go to the cemetery to visit his grave, hoping that might calm whatever was happening. When we arrived, what we saw left us frozen. The earth over his grave was disturbed, as if someone had tried to dig it up. The flowers we had left were withered, even though only a few days had passed. The wooden cross marking his grave was broken, snapped, clean in half. The cemetery caretaker said he hadn't seen anything, but his pale face said otherwise. That night, the footsteps in our house grew louder and more frequent. They no longer just walked down the halls. They seemed to come from everywhere. The walls creaked, the doors opened and slammed shut on their own, and my grandfather's chair rocked back and forth as if someone was sitting in it. My sister screamed from her room, saying someone was trying to get in. When I ran to check, I found the door scratched, as if something had clawed at it from the outside. The next day, we found a note inside one of the drawers in my grandfather's chair. It was his handwriting, there was no doubt. It read, "What I did cannot be undone, but I will not let you bear the consequences. Forgive me." My mother burst into tears reading it, but I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't know if that meant it was over, or if this was only the beginning. That same night, something happened that I will never forget. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment the whole house fell into a deathly silence. Then the chair began to move, first slowly, then violently, as if something invisible had grabbed it and thrown it across the room. We stood frozen, too terrified to move. That was when my mother began to pray, begging my grandfather to find peace, to stop tormenting us. The footsteps stopped that night, but the air in the house never felt the same again. Little by little, the strange occurrences faded, but they never completely disappeared. Even now, when I'm alone, I sometimes feel like something is watching me from the chair. We've replaced it several times, but somehow it always seems to come back. There are nights, right before I fall asleep, when I hear the wood creak, like someone settling into the chair, silently watching me. Years have passed since then, but that feeling never left. My mother says my grandfather finally found peace, but I'm not so sure. I believe whatever he did in life marked him forever, and somehow part of him is still here, bound to this world by a pact he never should have made. Maybe it really wasn't his time, like he said in my dream. But if it wasn't his time, then what took him? That's a question I'll probably never be able to answer. The girl in the white coffin. The first things people forget after a tragedy are the small details, the exact color of the flowers, the expressions on the faces of those who attended, even the shade of the sky. However, some moments carve themselves so deeply into your mind that not even the passing years can erase them. My name is Andrew. I'm from Ohio. And what I experienced at my cousin Emily's funeral still haunts me to this day. It was 1998. I was just 11 years old, and I had never been to a funeral before. To me, death was a strange concept, something that happened to old people, not to 9-year-old girls like my cousin. But there we were, the entire family gathered in a cold, silent funeral home, surrounded by candles and flowers that failed to mask the scent of wax and wood. Emily had died suddenly, a mild illness that turned into a fever, and then, without warning, her heart just stopped. No one could understand it. My parents whispered about medical terms that made no sense, while my aunt broke down crying over and over. The wake started at sunset, and as the hours dragged on, sadness gave way to a heavy atmosphere, thick with something I couldn't explain. The adults prayed in unison, their monotonous voices filling the room like an endless chant. Bored and uncomfortable, I wandered off to explore the place. Emily's coffin stood at the center of the room, surrounded by floral arrangements that seemed far too large for such a small body. I approached cautiously, as if simply getting closer could disturb something sacred. It was the first time I had ever seen a coffin up close. My parents always told me not to stare too long, to respect the dead, but curiosity outweighed fear. I stood before the glass panel that covered her face and saw her. Emily, dressed in a white gown that was too big for her, hands crossed over. Her chest, her expression peaceful, almost like she was asleep, but something felt off about the way she looked. I'll never forget her eyes. Even though they were closed, I had the strangest feeling that she was watching me, like she knew I was there. I stood there for a while in silence, waiting for the discomfort to fade, but it never did. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing, the faint curve of her lips, almost forming a smile. That couldn't be possible. I rubbed my eyes and leaned closer. It was impossible for a dead girl to smile, right? But there it was, a slight, eerie grin that turned her once peaceful face into something mocking, as if she was enjoying my confusion. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when it happened. The coffin, which had been completely still, began to vibrate, faintly at first, then more noticeably. I froze, unable to move, as the wood creaked under a force I couldn't see. Every part of me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then the glass panel fogged up, as if someone inside had exhaled against it. And that's when I saw what would haunt me for the rest of my life. Emily's eyes slowly opened. They stared directly at me, empty, yet filled with something I can't describe. It wasn't sadness, anger, or fear. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. My throat tightened, and all I could do was back away until I hit a table behind me. I screamed with everything I had, bringing the adults, running from the next room. By the time they arrived, everything was normal again. The coffin was closed, the glass was spotless, and Emily's eyes were shut, just like before. My parents scolded me for causing a scene, saying I was exhausted and imagining things, but I knew what I saw. That night, when we finally got home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily's open eyes staring at me from the darkness. I tried convincing myself it was just my imagination, nerves and fear playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. In the days that followed, strange things started happening around the house. Photos of Emily, the ones my aunt had given to everyone, would fall from their frames without reason. The candles we lit for her would flicker, as if someone were blowing on them. And once, the bathroom mirror fogged up, covered in tiny fingerprints that didn't match anyone in the house. I tried to talk to my parents about it, but they said it was normal. We were all grieving, and sometimes grief makes you see things that aren't there. But what happened a week after the burial is what convinced me there was something more behind Emily's death. My aunt, who hadn't stopped crying since the funeral, decided to visit the cemetery that night. She wanted to leave a letter she had written, a kind of goodbye to help her move forward. I went with her, more because I was too scared to stay home alone than because I actually wanted to go. Emily's grave was in a secluded corner of the cemetery, surrounded by trees that seemed unnaturally tall under the moonlight. My aunt placed the letter carefully on the headstone, whispering words I couldn't quite make out. While she wept silently, something caught my eye. The earth in front of the grave was disturbed, as if someone had tried to dig it up. I called my aunt, but she didn't seem to hear me. I stepped closer, drawn in by that unsettling sight, and that's when I saw it. A footprint, small and unmistakable, too tiny to belong to an adult. That night my aunt returned home, feeling strangely at peace, saying she felt like Emily had sent her a sign that she was okay. I couldn't share her relief. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was that disturbed earth, those tiny footprints, and those wide staring eyes in the coffin. As time passed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least it did for everyone else. My family moved on and Emily's name was mentioned less and less. But for me, everything changed that day. There are nights when I dream of her, exactly as I saw her in the coffin, white dress, serene face, but in my dreams she's always smiling. And her eyes, they are always open, watching me, just like they did that night. When I wake up, I can't help but wonder if what I experienced was real or just the imagination of a scared child. But then I remember the footprints at the cemetery, the candles that flickered on their own, and that creaking wood sound that I can still hear if I focus too hard. To this day, I avoid funerals. I can't handle the thought of standing near another coffin and reliving that moment. Whenever someone asks why, I just say funerals make me uncomfortable, that they make me nervous. But the truth is, I'm terrified, afraid that if I get too close to another coffin, I'll see those eyes again, and this time they might not be just a memory. There's nothing more unsettling than realizing that someone's death isn't the end, but the start of something much worse. My name is Henry, and I grew up in a small town in New Mexico, a place where superstitions weren't just stories. They were part of life itself. Tales of witches, curses, and supernatural events were common, but I always believed they were just scary bedtime stories meant to keep kids in line. That belief changed forever after my Uncle Paul's funeral in 1995. It wasn't just a strange coincidence, nor a trick of my imagination. It was real, something I still can't explain. My Uncle Paul was a simple, hard-working man, loved by everyone in town. He died suddenly of a heart attack while working on the family ranch. His death caught us all off guard, especially since he was only 50 and had never shown signs of illness. My grandmother, his mother, was devastated. She kept saying no parent should bury their child, that it went against the natural order. But there was something strange in the way she spoke about his death, something beyond grief. It was almost fear, like she knew more than she was telling. The wake was held at my grandmother's house, following the town's tradition. Black curtains covered the windows, and dozens of candles lit the room where the coffin rested on a makeshift altar. Family and neighbors came in and out, offering condolences and prayers. Everything felt like a normal wake, until she arrived, an old woman none of us recognized. Her face was wrinkled like aged leather, and her white hair hung in messy strands. She wore a long black dress, and what stood out the most was the candle in her hand. A black candle. I'd never seen anything like it before. The woman entered, silently, and stood at the back of the room, barely visible in the shadows. She didn't pray, didn't speak to anyone, didn't approach the family. She simply stood there, holding that candle, motionless. There was something about her presence that made the air heavy, like she was pulling the light out of the room. I tried not to look at her, but I couldn't help sneaking glances, waiting for someone to ask who she was or ask her to leave. But no one did. Even the bravest men in town seemed to pretend she wasn't there. When it was time to close the coffin, the woman moved. She walked slowly toward the altar, gliding more than stepping, like her feet never touched the ground. Some guests stepped aside to let her pass, while others froze in their seats, eyes wide with uncertainty. My grandmother, who had been quiet all night, stood up and demanded the woman leave. But the old woman didn't reply. She simply placed the black candle on the floor, right in front of the coffin, then turned and walked out without a word or a backward glance. No one tried to stop her. We were too shocked to react. That night, my grandmother gathered the family and told us something I'll never forget. She swore that the woman was a witch and that someone in town had hired her to curse my uncle's soul. According to her, the black candle was a tool of dark magic, a sign that his spirit would never find rest. My mother tried to calm her, saying grief was clouding her mind, but my grandmother was certain. She kept repeating that we had welcomed evil into our home, and now we'd have to pay the price. The next day, they buried my uncle in the town cemetery. The sky was overcast, and the air carried a strange metallic scent, like a storm was brewing. As they lowered the coffin into the ground, I looked around and saw something that made my blood run cold. The old woman was there again, standing at the edge of the cemetery, half hidden among the trees. She watched in silence, motionless, like a shadow that didn't belong to the world around her. No one else seemed to notice, or, if they did, they chose not to say a word. When the ceremony ended and people started to leave, I glanced back at the trees. But she was gone. The days that followed were filled with unease. My grandmother visited my uncle's grave every day, bringing fresh flowers. But no matter how many she left, they were always dead by the next morning, wilted and grey, like something had drained the life out of them. It wasn't normal. The flowers on the surrounding graves stayed fresh, untouched. Only his seemed to rot overnight. My grandmother was certain it was the curse of the black candle. My mother tried to reason with her, saying it was just the heat. The soil, anything but a curse. But each day that passed made it harder to ignore. And then, a week after the burial, something happened that convinced me my grandmother was right. It was a night with no wind, eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without knowing why. My mother, grandmother, and I were sitting in the living room when we heard a noise coming from the backyard. We went outside to check, and what we found froze us in place. The makeshift altar from the wake, which my grandmother refused to take down, had been destroyed. Candles lay scattered, flowers shredded, and the crucifix that hung on the wall was lying on the ground, its arms broken clean off. And in the middle of it all, standing exactly where the coffin had been, was the black candle, lit. None of us dared to touch it. My grandmother started to pray, clutching her rosary, while my mother grabbed my arm and pulled me back inside. That night, none of us slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the old woman standing among the trees holding that candle. I kept wondering what her presence had meant. Was it just a warning, or had she done something more? Something we couldn't undo. The next morning, my grandmother decided she couldn't leave things as they were. She called for a spiritual healer, an old man known for breaking curses and protecting souls. He arrived at the cemetery carrying a sack full of herbs, holy water, and strange objects I didn't recognize. He performed a ritual around my uncle's grave, burning herbs and chanting words I couldn't understand. When he finished, he said my uncle's spirit was now protected, but there was hesitation in his voice, a flicker of doubt in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely convinced his ritual would be enough. That night, the dreams started. I dreamed of my uncle, but not as I remembered him. In the dream, his skin was pale, his eyes sunken, his face covered in dark, twisted marks, like something had eaten away at him from the inside. He stood outside my grandmother's house, holding the black candle. He didn't speak, but his presence alone filled me with a dread so deep I woke up trembling. My grandmother had the same dream. She believed it was a sign, proof that his soul was still trapped, unable to move on. As time passed, we stopped visiting his grave. My grandmother said it was better not to draw attention to whatever might still be lingering there. But even after all these years, people still say something isn't right with that plot. Flowers don't last, the soil looks darker, and some claim they've seen shadows moving unnaturally between the trees. No one dares to go too close after dark. My grandmother is gone now, but before she died, she made me promise something, that I would never let my uncle's memory fade. She said, forgetting is the only thing cursed souls fear more than the curse itself. And sometimes, on the stillest nights, when the air feels too heavy and the silence presses against your chest, I swear I can feel the old woman's presence, like she's still waiting, still watching, as if the black candle's purpose was never truly fulfilled. Tragedies don't end with death, they begin with it. My name is Sophia, and what I lived through at my cousin Jessica's funeral in 2010 is something I've never been able to forget. Every time I close my eyes, that night comes back with terrifying clarity, like I'm trapped in a cycle that refuses to end. Jessica died on her wedding day, a day that should have been the happiest of her life, but became an unforgettable nightmare. Sometimes, I wonder if something beyond our understanding decided her story couldn't end so simply. Jessica and her fiancé, Michael, were the perfect couple. They had been together for years, and the whole town looked forward to their wedding, which had been planned for months. Everything was ready, the church, the reception, the dress, but fate had other plans. On the way to the altar, in the car Michael was driving, a truck lost control on a curve and crashed into them. Michael survived with minor injuries, but Jessica wasn't so lucky. News spread quickly, and the day that should have been a celebration became a wake. Jessica's mother, my aunt, insisted that her daughter should be laid to rest, wearing the wedding dress she never got to wear at the altar. Some said it was disrespectful, that a white dress wasn't meant for death, but my aunt said her daughter deserved to look like the bride she dreamed of being, even in death. The wake took place in the town hall, a large room dimly lit by old chandeliers and surrounded by heavy curtains that barely let any light inside. From the moment I stepped in, I knew something was wrong. Jessica's body lay at the center of the room, surrounded by white flowers and flickering candles. Her dress was beautiful, but seeing it in that context made it grotesque, like her beauty was a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. Her makeup was soft and delicate, but her face seemed too perfect, too still. I stood there staring for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of how someone so full of life just hours before could now lie frozen in a coffin. While friends and family gathered to pray, the lights began to flicker. At first, no one thought much of it. The town's wiring was old and unreliable. But as the night dragged on, the flickering became rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone was playing with a switch. I remember sitting by one of the windows, watching Jessica's coffin from a distance. There was something about the way the candlelight reflected on the glass that unsettled me. That's when I noticed it. The reflection didn't match what was in front of me. The flowers and candles were there, but Jessica, who should have been, still appeared to be leaning slightly to the side, as if trying to sit up. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, but every time I looked back, the reflection shifted again. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the prayers echoing through the room, but the air felt heavy, like the whole room was caught in some invisible tension. That's when Michael, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, suddenly stood up. His eyes were locked on Jessica's coffin, his face drained of all color. Without saying a word, he walked toward the center, staring at her like he saw something no one else could. Then, without warning, he turned and ran out of the hall. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loud I thought everyone could hear it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that exhaustion and sadness were making me see things. But then something happened that shattered any doubt. One of the candles toppled over, rolling across the floor until it stopped at the foot of the coffin. The melted wax formed a strange pattern, almost like letters, though I couldn't read them. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost too soft to catch. but unmistakable. It was the rustling of Jessica's dress, like something was dragging it across the wood. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I ran out of the hall, followed by others who also sensed that something was terribly wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jessica's reflection shifting in the glass, the grey petals falling, and shadows from the candles forming impossible shapes. I tried to convince myself it was grief, fear, anything but reality, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. Days later, when we returned to the hall to clean up, we found something none of us could explain. Jessica's wedding dress, the one she had been buried in, was lying on the floor, completely burned. The wax marks on the floor had formed a perfect circle around the coffin, as if something had stood guard around her through the night. No one spoke of what we saw. My aunt, shattered by grief, insisted Jessica was finally at peace. But I knew that wasn't true. Since that night, I've avoided funerals. Just hearing Jessica's name makes my chest tighten like something unseen, is reminding me of what I witnessed. Michael still speaks of Jessica from his hospital bed. He says he still sees her dancing between the candles, still feels her presence near him. And sometimes when I'm alone, I feel it too. Some jobs make you numb to death, or so they say. I'm not so sure that's true. My name is Anthony, and I've spent over 20 years working as a gravedigger at a small cemetery on the outskirts of New Mexico. What happened in 2005 forever changed the way I see my job, and to this day, I wonder if I should have quit right then and never stepped foot in a cemetery again. I still carry the weight of that night, like it's carved into my skin. No matter how much I try to forget, I can't. Because some things stay with you forever, especially the feeling that you witnessed something that doesn't belong to this world. It all started with the burial of a woman named Mrs. Rose. She was known in town for her reserved nature and for living completely alone, except for her only son, John, who was in his early 40s when she passed. When she died, the gossip started. Immediately, people said Mrs. Rose wasn't an ordinary woman, that she was involved in dark things, that she had knowledge no one else possessed. Some claimed they had seen her at night, carrying candles and strange objects into the cemetery, whispering prayers in a language no one understood. Others swore her house was always full of black chickens and cats with glowing yellow eyes that followed her everywhere. The day of her funeral, the whole town showed up, not out of respect, but out of curiosity. They wanted to see if something strange would happen, something that would confirm all the stories. I was there early, preparing the grave where she would rest. Everything seemed normal, except for this heavy unease hanging in the air. When the procession arrived, I noticed John right away. His skin was pale, his hands trembled, and his eyes stared off into nothing, like his mind wasn't even there. As the priest began the ceremony, John stepped forward, staring at the coffin, and then he did something that froze everyone in place. In a shaking voice, he started shouting, begging them not to bury his mother. He said she had made a pact, that if they put her in the ground, something terrible would happen. People tried to calm him down, some saying grief was clouding his mind, others laughing it off as nonsense. But I saw the look in his eyes, pure terror mixed with desperation. That kind of fear isn't easy to fake. Eventually, they pulled him back, and the burial went on like nothing had happened. That night, I stayed late at the cemetery, finishing, upsealing the grave. I often worked after dark to make sure the earth settled properly and to keep animals from digging around. As I worked, the air grew heavier with every passing minute. The full moon lit up the cemetery, and the shadows from the crosses and headstones stretched in ways that didn't feel natural. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling. that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something standing there. The silence was thick, the kind that presses against your skin, making you aware of every breath you take. When I finally placed the headstone on Mrs. Rose's grave, that's when it happened. The moment my hand touched the stone, a deep, guttural sound echoed up from the earth itself. I froze, staring at the grave, trying to understand what I had just heard. It wasn't the wind or the ground settling. It was a sound that felt alive, like something was trying to speak from below. And then I felt it. I can't fully explain, but the air around the grave grew heavier, charged with a presence I couldn't see, but I knew it was there. I forced myself to finish the job, moving as fast as I could, refusing to let fear control me. On my walk home, I couldn't stop thinking about what John had said. What if he was right? What if his mother had done something in life that was now affecting everyone involved in her death? I barely slept that night, waking every hour with a vague sense that something was wrong, though I couldn't say what. The next morning I arrived at the cemetery like usual. Everything seemed normal at first, until I saw him. John was there, lying face down at his mother's grave. His head was turned toward the headstone, eyes wide open, locked in a frozen stare of pure terror. I'll never forget the look on his face, as if he had seen something so horrific his mind couldn't survive it. I wanted to run to him, but my legs wouldn't move. After several agonizing seconds, I gathered the courage to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they took his body away, but they couldn't find a clear cause of death. There were no injuries, no marks, just that expression like fear itself had killed him. Rumors spread through the town like wildfire. Some said John had dug up his mother's coffin during the night and saw something inside that no living person was meant to see. Others claimed he simply stood too close to the grave, and whatever his mother had been part of reached out and took him. After that night, everything changed. Every time I walked past Mrs. Rose's grave, I felt pressure on my chest, like invisible hands were trying to push me away. I wasn't the only one who felt it. The other workers started avoiding that section of the cemetery altogether. Even visitors said they couldn't stand near her grave for long without feeling sick or uneasy. Some swore the candles left at her tomb would blow out without a single gust of wind. Others said the flowers wilted almost instantly, as if the soil itself rejected them. One afternoon, while cleaning a nearby section, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The headstone over Mrs. Rose's grave had cracks that hadn't been there before. They were thin at first, but they spidered out across the stone, like something underneath was trying to break free. I backed away, but I couldn't stop staring, half expecting something or someone to claw its way out right in front of me. Not long after, the cemetery's management made the decision to seal the grave completely. They poured concrete over. The plot reinforced the headstone and treated the whole area like a hazardous zone, even though no one spoke openly about why. But we all knew, everyone who worked there understood that whatever was buried under that stone wasn't resting, and it never would. Over time, Mrs. Rose and her son became a legend, a ghost story whispered about in hushed tones. People in town avoided walking past the cemetery at night, and those brave enough to wander too close swore they felt someone watching from the darkness. I kept my job, though I never worked that section alone again. I learned to ignore the things I couldn't explain, to look away from the graves that felt wrong, and to focus only on the earth under my shovel. But no matter how much time has passed, I've never forgotten the look in John's eyes, or the sound that came from the ground that night. Sometimes I wonder if I did something wrong, if my hands unknowingly sealed a curse into that soil. But then I remember, some things are beyond our understanding, and some graves are far from empty. The only thing I know for sure is this: Mrs. Rose's grave isn't like the others. It stands as a reminder that death isn't always the end, and that some souls, even after death, still have unfinished business with the living.